Okay, so as Diane indicated, this is a moment in which we have to have a change in paradigm, and that's a message that Helga LaRouche has been emphasizing. The conference we're going to have in 2 weeks is going to be on that same subject. And in fact, if you, I'll just let people know that there is a website that has been set up, which is www.schillerinstitute.com, the German spelling of institute, where the speeches and so forth from the conference that Diane referenced are up there. And the point that Helga made in her presentation, and the point that Lynn keeps making, is that this is an existential crisis right now for civilization, in which either we have a shift into a completely new paradigm, or we continue with the empire system, which will rapidly collapse like all empires have collapsed. The imperial form of social organization that has dominated mankind for all history. There has been progress in spite of it, but the dominant characteristic that has governed society has been this imperial paradigm. And that all empires, for reasons which I'm going to explain, inevitably crash. The difference between now and all previous times is that this is the first time in history that man has achieved such a global form of social organization and has mastered science and technology to the level that if this empire collapses without a shift to a new paradigm, it will extinguish civilization. Because man now has control of power, particularly thermonuclear power. We have control over thermonuclear power. We might not be able to produce electricity with fusion energy yet, but we have detonated thermonuclear bombs. We can make thermonuclear energy on Earth. And given that that's the state of power of the human species, if that power is unleashed, it will wipe out all civilization. A thermonuclear exchange between the United States, Russia, and China will last about an hour and a half, and anybody who doesn't die in that first hour and a half will die in the next year or so by starvation, disease, and collapse of culture. Whether or not all living forms of life will cease to exist on this planet is not known, but I don't think we want to find out. Now, the greenies will say, oh, well, therefore we should get rid of this thermonuclear power, and then we will alleviate the threat of a collapse of civilization and still be able to maintain the empire system. And there, in a certain sense, gives you what our problem is, which is that people think that the empire system is the only possible system. And by empire system, what I mean is a system in which man is considered no different than any other living organism, any other species, in which the individual human being interacts with the universe only through the domain of sense perception, and that this interaction among the domain of sense perception begins with our birth and ends with our death, just like a cow or a dog or a tiger or a lion. A dog can smell much better than people can. You know, a tiger or a lion can see at night much better than we can. And they interact with the world according to sense perception. And when they biologically reproduce, but when a tiger gives birth to a cub, the mother tiger, cares for the cub long enough for the cub to be able to hunt on its own, and then that's it. And when the mother tiger dies, you think the cub cares? There's only the interaction of the individual organism, or at best an individual organism relating in a pack type of thing, say with wolves or dogs, to the universe, which begins with birth and ends with death. And this is what the empire thinks of human beings. This is what Diane was talking about earlier in terms of Ezekiel Emanuel. That, what you are is your biological existence. That's it. And whatever interacts with you with your sense perception is all there is. And in order then to keep this mass of humanity, these mass of organisms under control, the imperial system will acknowledge that there's a certain distinction between men, human beings, and animals. And that the distinction is that you have to have a certain select group of selected out of this organism of human beings to keep the rest of humanity under control. And this belief in its various forms, whether we're talking about the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, empires who we know of because of their stories that are recounted about them through ancient legends and myths and stuff like that. Or modern empires like the British Empire or the Roman Empire, the Venetian Empire, which is really just a continuation of the same thing. That this is the way it is, this is the way it always will be, and this is the nature of things. And this is an embedded cultural paradigm that dominates society today. And at best you get are people who say, well, that's wrong. That's not good. But they don't have a conception of what is. Right? Most people, you have this false belief that the imperial system is the only system. And you hear this all the time where people say things like, oh, well, Arabs and Jews have been fighting each other forever in the Middle East. Or there will always be war. Right? There will always be war. There will always be killing. There will always be evil. There will always be people who will seek to do harm to other people. Well, that's not true. There isn't always going to be war. We're either going to outlaw war, or war will outlaw mankind. But I guarantee you there will not always be war. We've come to the point in human civilization where war is no longer a means by which anything can be accomplished. No one has won a war since World War II. No one could ever win a war, ever again. And if war doesn't end, war will end mankind. So for people to say there will always be war because there always has been war is just insane. So the best you get is people who say, well, there's always been war, but that's wrong, and we should therefore be against war. But they don't have an idea of, well, what is a world without war supposed to look like? Is it supposed to just be nice and peace where everybody's friendly with each other? And you say, well, that'll never happen. So therefore, we're always going to have war. So unless we have a positive conception of what mankind should be, this new paradigm, we will never really defeat the empire. We have a real important mission, first of all, which is to wake people up as to what it is they're living in. Because when you're blinded by this false belief that the empire is the only system, you don't even have a sense that that's what you're living in. That's the way the world is, right? And as I say, if you shock people about this enough, like with this thing with Ezekiel Emanuel, or this threat of nuclear war, the threat of asteroid defense, you can get somebody to say, well, that's not right. What are we going to do about that? We have to stop that. Yes, we should stop war. Yes, we should get better health care. We should stop this right to die movement. We should, stop starvation. So you get a negative reaction to something bad that shouldn't be. But we have to do more than just that. We have to give people a sense and create a movement for this new paradigm where people actually understand what should be. And that is really the nub of what I want to try and address today, at least briefly. I don't claim to be able to give you the whole story on this. in this shorter period of time anyway. But I will try and use some examples to illustrate what should be. I guess another way of saying what I'm trying to say here is that we should not define what is by something that is not what isn't. The imperial system isn't the nature of man, but we can't define man as being simply not what the empire says we are. We have to know who we are. Now, LaRouche has made this very explicit, and it's not a secret. I'm not, I don't have some secret word I'm going to say in a few seconds, which has never been uttered before about what what man actually is. But, which is that man is fundamentally not a creature of sense perception, but the only species which possesses creativity. Creativity as not as a characteristic of the human being. Now, you say, what is creativity? It's not an arm, it's not a leg, it's not a sense organ, it's not the brain, it's not a biological part of our makeup. But it is something that every human being possesses, and a small number of human beings actually are conscious of it and exercise it, both in our current society and also throughout history. And therefore, to really understand this new, this principle of creativity, we have to understand it from the standpoint of, from this principle of creativity, we have to understand how it's exercised. Because people actually, we as individuals, have to begin to understand what creativity is. Lynn often refers to it as creativity per se. And because if you have a positive conception of what creativity is, then you're not just fighting the empire because it appears to advocate or develop or create things, produce conditions which we don't like, but that we actually are fighting for something that is positive. Now, we know creativity. Every one of you knows of the existence of this creativity because it's inherent in every human being, and it's always expressed in children. And the problem is that because our culture, this culture in particular, is so degenerate, this impulse, this creative capability, which children express all the time in the form of discovering and inventing and coming up with new discoveries about the world, even though they're not revolutionary discoveries, but to the child they're revolutionary because you see when a little child learns to walk for the first time, the child's so excited. It's as if this was the first time ever in the history of the world that anybody ever learned to walk, right? The child is made is getting an experience of a creative discovery. Now, animals do that kind of thing. They learn to do things as they grow up, but they don't experience it as an act of creativity. They don't reflect on what they do and see in it a power of their own mind that they can build on. But in this degenerate culture, that impulse for creativity is rapidly snuffed out. It's rapidly snuffed out in the social system. It's rapidly snuffed out in the educational system. And over the last 2 generations, it's been increasingly snuffed out by the effect of our popular culture. I'm talking about the music. I'm talking about the television programs, the movies, the books, the entertainment, the clothing, the social behavior, which rapidly snuffs that out. And so therefore, that impulse for creativity, we have a particularly large burden on our shoulders, right, and to solve this problem, because we're trying to teach people the essence of humanity as being creative, in a culture which for 3 generations has been destroying creativity. And this is one of the reasons why Lynn has emphasized that if you want to do politics today, you have to be a master of the principles of scientific discovery and artistic discovery, the great artistic and scientific discoveries of the past. It's true these things are important to know just in and of themselves, because if you want to be a literate human being, you should understand what Kepler's discovery of universal gravitation is. You should be familiar with the music of Bach. But for a political leadership, you have to know these, you have to understand this, because this is the only real way you can learn creativity. You can learn creativity by studying creativity as it's expressed in the great developments of the past. Obviously, we also need to understand these things because it's on these discoveries on which the progress of mankind has depended. And if we're going to chart a future for mankind, we're going to have to know at least what the domain is of the future discoveries that need to occur. And we've talked about this in the literature, which most of the people here are familiar with, the need for the space program and discovery of Mars and so on and so forth. And those things are also fascinating to elaborate in a lot of detail. But what I'd like to do today is, through a few examples, give you a sense of how all these things are tied together from the standpoint that creativity is the fundamental question that's facing mankind right now. That is, developing a leadership of society that understands, has a positive conception of the creative powers of the mind. Not a mysterious conception that we have to stop the empire in order for some mystical thing that we don't understand called creativity to somehow emerge. But what is real creativity? And then if you can get in yourself a positive sense of creativity, then you can have, and only then, in my view, do you really have the passion to fight the empire. You'll be defeated if the only thing you're fighting for is to stop something bad. You have to have a sense of what is good. Sometimes you don't get the sense of what is good until you realize what bad is. But you also have to have a sense of what actual real creativity is. And as I said, the creativity expresses itself in two related, but oftentimes, distinguished fields. One is the field in which creativity is expressed in the form of discovering something about how the world works, how the universe functions, beyond the domain of our sense perception. And those types of discoveries are called scientific discoveries. And then the other type of this creativity, which is actually a higher form of creativity, the one on which the scientific discoveries depends, is where creativity discovers principles about creativity itself. And we call that artistic creativity. And the artist is the one who is able to investigate how the mind itself works. And that provides the advancement to give the scientist the ability to make discoveries about how the universe works. And when you look at any great scientist, they all acknowledge this. Kepler, in this first book on gravity called the Mysterium Cosmographicum, Kepler says, he discusses how when you look at the universe, you have to think about it as an artist. And in fact, he said it's as if nature imitates art. That it's the artistic principle which governs nature, so therefore you have to understand the artistic principle. And Einstein famously said that imagination is more important than anything else in science. And he said that I'm enough of an artist to know that. So it's in this investigation of scientific creativity and artistic creativity that one can begin to see how creativity works and what it is exactly. Now the first, what I'd like to do, just to, with that preface, is to go through a couple of examples, which I think is several examples, which I think is the most efficient way in this setting to try and illustrate this point. My intention is not to clue you in on all the fundamentals of every one of these discoveries. That would take a whole series of classes and a lot of discussion. But with the intention here is to use these examples just to try and hone in a little bit on this question of creativity, what creativity is. And it will take a little bit of concentration because of that. That is, because I'm not going to go through every step of every single discovery. It's going to move kind of fast, and there might be some things you don't quite pick up on. But if you sort of keep in mind that the animal we're hunting here, our prey, as Cusa talked about, Nicholas of Cusa wrote a beautiful dialogue called On the Hunt for Wisdom, and he talks about we're like hunters today, and we're going to be hunting for this idea of creativity. So that's our goal here. So don't get too worried about missing every step. Now, the point that LaRouche keeps emphasizing, and I know sometimes people get a little bit annoyed at how persistent he is at emphasizing this, because you think once he says it once, you got it, and maybe if he says it 10 times, at least by then you finally got it. Why does he keep repeating it? Is that the key issue here is the question of getting outside the domain of sense perception. And you think of all the simple reasons why you think that's true, but LaRouche is as you know, an old, experienced fighter, and he also knows that the longer you live, the more you realize that the fundamental things that you thought you had resolved in even someone who's like a creative person like LaRouche, who spends their whole life in scientific discovery and is always making new discoveries. But you find one thing that's sort of characteristic when you study the lives of great thinkers, that they always find that the things they thought they had solved early on in their earliest childhoods come back again and again and again, and you really don't quite understand it. There's really a deeper principle here. So this question of getting beyond the domain of sense perception is that principle. It's something that the more you look at it, the more you begin to question it, the more you begin to think about it, the more you realize how fundamental it is. And it's at the nub of every discovery there is. Now, so let me take the first one, which I think will set the stage for the ones that will follow, and that is Kepler's discovery of universal gravitation. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, and I know Jason Ross has been up here, and he's a wonderful pedagogue, so I'm sure most of you have, through his classes, mastered the vicarious hypothesis and everything else. But I'm going to just focus on a little aspect of this, which I think gets at the heart of it, which is what Kepler was actually dealing with. Now, first of all, think about the period of history in which Kepler was living, right? You know, he comes into onto this earth at the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, end of 1500s, beginning of 1600s, and Europe has been engulfed for the last 100 years in a series of religious wars. The most horrific is about to break out, which we today know is the 30 Years' War. But you know how wars start. They didn't start in 1618 and said, now we're going to fight a war for 30 years. They thought the war would be over in a few days, just like people marching off to World War I. They said this war will be over quickly. But so Kepler comes into this period where there's been religious warfare. Religious warfare is the worst form of warfare because it has no way to resolve it. I mean, you know, you can't kill your enemy into changing their religion. I guess when you kill them, they don't have their old religion anymore, but you haven't converted them. So religious warfare has no end, which is why the empire always uses religious warfare. And Kepler's born as a Protestant in the Catholic area, who's educated and becomes an early follower of the ideas of a famous Catholic thinker, Nicholas of Cusa, who was hated by most of the authorities in the Catholic Church because what he discussed in his scientific discoveries was against the empire's domination of both the Catholic and Protestant religions. So Kepler's looking at this world, which is a world similar to ours, but ours is worse for the reasons I said, that it's global, in that there was no really civil society. There was just war. His father was a mercenary soldier who would go off and fight in a war to get money to feed his family. And every once in a while he'd come home and see the kids and then go off and fight a war. And one day he went off and fought a war and never came back again. Nobody knows where he died, what war, what battle he was killed in. And Kepler realized early on that the reason that this was going on was for the same thing I've been discussing, which is that people didn't have a real conception of what the universe actually was. That they only knew this world of chaos. And the way that got conveyed to both the intellectual class and the simple-minded people of the time was through a certain mythology about astronomy. And this is an important principle. I'll just put a little parentheses here, that what governs the people's behavior oftentimes is not what they say it is. It has to do with what we were talking about earlier, this idea of a paradigm, the way they think about the world. And the way people think about the world is usually conveyed in the form of myths and legends and stories. And now today people call those scientific theories. But there's no difference between what today people call a scientific theory and a myth or a legend, because it is held as a belief without any real sense of knowledge that is true, whether it's true or not. And the myth, the general myth that had dominated society for basically 2,000 years from the murder of Archimedes, was that the most perfect form, the most perfect thing in the universe is things that don't change. Right? Because if something is perfect, it doesn't have to change. How can it get more perfect? Right? If it's absolutely perfect. So the myth was God is perfect, so he doesn't have to change, right? And then you go down from there, right? So God is perfect, he doesn't have to change. And man is nothing but change. You know, we're born, we grow into adults, then we grow old, and then we die. That's all change, right? We start off as kids who don't know how to speak. We learn to speak. We develop capabilities. We develop knowledge, and then we disappear. Everything about human beings is changing. Everything about life is changing. Every living organism it comes into existence and then goes out of existence. It grows. It changes. Everything on Earth is changing. So, therefore, everything that happens with man, everything that happens in Earth, all this changing that you see all around you, that is the universe, is as far away from God as you could possibly get. And if you want proof of that, just go out and look at the night sky. Because you look at the night sky, you can see it with your own eyes, this theory. Because if you go out and you look at the night sky, you see everything that's close to you is changing. And as you get further away from you, you get to the moon. That changes less than anything close to you. And you get to the planets, and that changes less than the moon. And you get to the fixed stars, and they change less than the planet. So the farther away you get from where you are, which is, you know, you're at the center of a big sphere, and the farther away you get from you, the less things change, and God, you know, is way up there. So that changes the least. So, and the best thing that can happen is that you should then live your life so that you don't change. And the best way to do that is to die, because once you die, you stop changing. At least your ideas stop changing. Your biology continues to change, because then you decay. So this was the, I mean, I'm being pretty, you know, short with my description of it, but when it got fairly elaborate, I mean, you know, people wrote whole volumes on this stuff, and ministers and priests gave sermons to back this thing up, and professors in medieval universities wrote tomes on this, and droned on and on and on to prove that this was really the nature of the universe, and that society had to reflect this, because in an imperial society, nothing's supposed to change, because nobody can do anything except the emperor always rules, and all change is run by the emperor. And this was the justification for the chaos and carnage which was dominating society. Because you say, this is the way things are. We're down here way away from God, and so we can kill each other and so forth, and that's no change. We have to have less and less change. The best form of society is the society which doesn't allow change. So what can we do to keep change out of society? And the best form of government for that is the imperial system. And this is what dominated things. And Kepler proved that that wasn't the case, because he said, wait a minute, if you go out and you look at the night sky, it's not how it appears that governs how it actually is. And that I can prove that, well, I can prove that the actual, what you see that's changing is not a sign of imperfection, but is evidence of the higher perfection of the universe, which he called the self-perfectibility of the universe. So that for Kepler, which he learned this from Cusa, that perfection is not a state of no change, but it's a state of self-perfectibility. And what on earth has the greatest capacity for self-perfectibility, i.e. man? So instead of the quality of man that the oligarchy said was the worst quality of man, the quality of change, Kepler said, no, this is the highest quality of man, because it's a quality of self-perfectibility, of making ourselves, as Cusa would say, ever less imperfect. Acknowledging we're imperfect, but recognizing that this idea of being ever less imperfect was the sign of man's goodness. And then Kepler said, and I will prove to you that this is actually a characteristic of the universe. This is not just something I say about man to make us feel good against the empire, but this is really the way the universe works. And the proof he gave of this was that he looked at Mars, the orbit of Mars. And in one sense, it's coincidental that he looked at the orbit of Mars, because his patron, Tycho Brahe, had been studying Mars and had developed a lot of important data, so he could precisely study Mars very well. But Kepler milked that irony for everything it was worth, because, you know, Mars was the Roman god of war. And so Kepler said, I'm going to harness Mars. I'm going to bring Mars into the domain of human mental power, and therefore I'm going to harness war with creativity. I'm going to end war with creativity. It's very, you know, he does this in all kinds of ways, but it's very beautiful. But the point is that when you go out and you look at the night sky, what happens when you look at a planet like Mars is that you will see that from night to night, the planet changes its position relative to the other stars around it. And over the course of about 680 days, Mars will appear in a complete circle of the planets around you. I mean, it just, everybody, of course, because of modern astrology, which they print in every newspaper and all over the internet, knows what the zodiac is, which is a circle of constellations which people think look like animals, so they give them animal names and other things. And these are the stars that are on the path that the sun travels over the course of the year. That is, if you go out at sunrise and you look, the sun rises in the east and you look west, you'll see some stars that are right on the horizon when the sun is rising. And from night to night, those stars change. And over the course of a year, it comes back and makes a full circle. So when you look at Mars, Mars does this also transition through the zodiac, like the sun, but it takes longer. It takes 686 days instead of 365, approximately. But the other thing Mars does, like the sun, is that the rate that it moves through the sky is not uniform. It's non-uniform. And it changes, it speeds up and slows down. You have experience with this also just by looking at the difference between your watch, that is an actual watch as opposed to a digital watch, and the position of the sun in the sky. You know, in the summertime, the sun reaches its zenith later in the day than in the wintertime when it reaches it earlier in the day. We tell time by our watches, which move uniformly around the clock face, whereas the sun doesn't obey that uniform watch. It rises and sets. The halfway point between rising and setting is different throughout the course of the year. And it makes a cycle, and that cycle changes the rate at which it's changing from time to time. Well, so therefore you have this paradox that when you go out and you look at the night sky, you see this thing is changing from time to time. And of course, man didn't create the planets. God supposedly did, so the oligarchy had to come up with some explanation for why God would have put this non-uniform motion in there. And the explanation they gave was, oh, well, it's just an illusion. That's just the way it looks. See, God wouldn't have put anything that was non-uniform in the heavens. It's actually uniform, but you think it's non-uniform because you're here on Earth and everything on Earth is all screwed up. So they had this, I'll make a little, uh-oh, what happened here? That thing went to sleep. Okay. All right, so my good friend Jason has made us a nice video that illustrates this. There it goes. Okay, so here's the bullshit explanation that the oligarchy gave for this phenomenon. They said, okay, you're standing here on Earth, which is this dot right here. It's hard to see that little red dot, right? And here's the sun, and if the planets are moving around the sun and you're here, and it appears to be speeding up and slowing down, okay? If you were standing right here, where this white circle is, this white dot is, then the planets would appear to be uniform. Now, if you watch that long enough and you don't get nauseous, you will see what I'm talking about. That the can I just replay it? I just push this button. Okay, you can see that the motion. If a viewer here, standing where that white dot is, would see the planets moving uniformly, as they wouldn't be speeding up and slowing down. But somebody here would see it speeding up and slowing down. Okay? And they said the problem is, the only reason why it appears to speed up and slow down is because you're in the wrong place. If you could be in this place, it would be, you would see how God really created the universe. Well, Kepler then did something which shocked everybody. He came up with you can turn on the lights now for a second. He came up with something which you read Lynn talk about a lot, called the vicarious hypothesis. The way he proved this was not true, he said, okay, suppose that was true. Where is that white dot? Where is that place that the world would look to be moving uniformly? And he proved, and you can go to Jason's website to walk through these steps yourself, but he proved that no such place existed. Now that's a very interesting type of proof, right? He proved that not only is the problem of science for us to try and find where that white dot is, he proved there is no such place. Now if there is no such place, then the planets are actually moving non-uniformly. They're always speeding up or they're always slowing down. And the question becomes then, well, how does the planet know how much to speed up or slow down? What's making the planet decide when to speed up and when to slow down? You can imagine a simple experiment to pose this problem to yourself. If you blindfold yourself and you try and walk in a circle, it's kind of hard, right? But if you put a post in the ground and you tie a string to that post, you can blindfold yourself and walk in a perfect circle, right? Just by keeping the rope taut and walking at right angles to the rope. So all you have to do is, once you have an orientation, is just keep doing what you're doing. That is, not change anything you're doing, and you'll make a perfect circle. But now if I tell you to walk even with your eyes open in an ellipse in which you're always speeding up and slowing down, you have to make a decision at every single moment how much to speed up and how much to slow down. So the question is, well, what would be telling the planet to do it? Are there some demigods on the planet? Is there like bus drivers who know the rules of the road and speed up and slow down? And Kepler said no. It doesn't require some type of mind in that sense, but it requires a type of mind in the sense of a human mind. That is, the non-uniform motion of the planet, the fact that I just proved that they actually are moving non-uniformly, is a proof that there's a characteristic of the physical universe which mirrors the characteristic of the mind. It's a power of change, and it's a fundamental characteristic of the universe itself. Now, the question is, what kind of change? Because you can have change, like when you have a lump of sugar and you put it in a cup of coffee, the lump of sugar becomes diffused in the coffee. But once it becomes all distributed into the coffee, it's done. It's not doing any more change, right? So you can have that kind of change, which goes from a higher state of order to a lower state of order. But when it reaches the lower state of order, it doesn't change anymore, right? That modern science calls entropy. In this example with Kepler, the example would also be the circular motion. Is another form of that kind of entropy. It's a kind of motion which doesn't change. Yeah, were you trying to? Yeah, go ahead.
Does he ever ask the question of why that is a fundamental part of the universe, the elliptical?
Well, the particular thing of the ellipse, he's never asked that particular question because he's never quite decided that the ellipse is the answer. And it really isn't the answer, because he realizes that it's not really a perfect ellipse and the ellipse changes and so on and so forth. But what he does start out with saying that the principle of non-uniform motion, in other words, whether it's an ellipse or some other shape, is secondary. The most important thing is that the universe itself is always changing, that is, the physical universe. In other words, he's saying that instead of going out and looking at the night sky and in the domain of sense perception, getting proof that this imperial system is the only system, perfection is no change, he's saying perfection is change. That God created the universe in such a way that it's always getting better. And Kepler was philosophically committed to the idea, because he was a student of Cusa, that was because that's the fundamental characteristic of the universe, and that the way he puts it is very poetically. He says, it's as if God looked to man, who was yet to be, and constructed the universe according to principles that man, who he was going to create, would find beautiful. That is, he was going to create a creative a consciously creative being, and that he constructed the universe according to the principles that would be coherent and beautiful to a consciously creative being. So he was committed to this on fundamental philosophical grounds from the standpoint of the nature of man. He didn't think God was a sadist. He didn't think that, like as the Aristotelians said, that God would create man with creative powers and then create a universe which was dead. He would, if he was going to give man creative powers, it was because those creative powers were going to do something in the universe. And therefore the universe had to have creativity in it. Now let me give another example which I think helps make this point. Now, closed. Oh, I go up here. Okay. And I'm going to bounce back and forth between a couple of examples. So here's the next one, which gets to the same similar point. Okay. Now there's a picture of a picture. But even though it's, maybe you should turn the lights off just so people can see a little better. This is a picture of a painting, which is, even though we're not looking at the painting directly, my point is made just by looking at the picture of the painting, which is that what this is a picture of, it's a picture of a man, okay? And what you can see in looking at that picture of the man, and even if you were looking at the painting, you could see that it's very skillful in terms of the depiction of the features of this person, right? And that requires a tremendous amount of skill, of course, but and that's one aspect of it. You could say, well, the artist here had a tremendous skill to be able to put on a flat canvas a series of marks which would reflect light off that canvas to your eyes in such a way as to stimulate your retinas to create an illusion of a physical body. Okay? But there's something else depicted in this painting. First of all, I'm not trying to be secretive here, so I don't reveal my punchline by telling you that this painting is a self-portrait of Rembrandt, and he did many self-portraits. So it's a painting of Rembrandt looking at himself, which is an interesting thing because you think of looking at yourself in the mirror as one way of looking at yourself. But that's really not the most important way of looking at yourself because you do that every morning and most of the time you probably don't even notice what you see. But what really means looking at yourself, when you really think about looking at yourself, it means reflecting on yourself. So right there is a little paradox, right? Because there's yourself and then there's you looking at yourself. So which is the real yourself? The thing you're looking at or the thing that's doing the looking? Right? When you think about looking at yourself. And here you have an opportunity to look at somebody looking at themselves. And you can see when I'm using the word yourself here, I'm not talking about the physical features. Although if it were just a blank canvas, there would be nothing to talk about, right? If this were, so there is a physical body there. But what you're looking at is somebody looking at their soul, at somebody looking at their mind. And in this case, it's a question of a creative person creating an image which inspires your imagination, not to create an image, but to imagine the thoughts, something completely outside the domain of sense perception, the thoughts of somebody, of another person, and in this case, somebody who died 400 years ago. So now, of course, if you see the painting in the museum, you have an even more profound experience, and you're fortunate in New York City to have good museums that you can reflect on this yourself. I mean, I admit this is a little bit crude in the way I'm doing this, but I think you get the point, right? That that what we have the capability as human beings to do is to have a clear, unambiguous concept. Maybe unambiguous is the wrong word, but a clear and distinct concept of something which is completely outside the domain of sense perception, which is the thoughts of another human being. And since this is a painting of Rembrandt as an old man, looking at himself as an old man, what you get in this thinking is not just like the thoughts of a person who's thinking about a particular thing, but somebody who is really reflecting on his own life, his own experiences, his relationship to immortality, somebody who is thinking about his soon-to-be death and what's happening in the world. And all this is depicted, is generated in your mind by the skill of the artist to be able to construct an image that reflects light in such a way as to inspire your mind to create in your imagination this image of the thought, but the subject is not the thought of the person, of the subject here, but to inspire you to have that experience. Because when you have that experience and you think about that experience, you know something positive about your own capability, creativity, that you have this power to imagine profound thoughts of another human being. Now, contrast that, of course, as I was saying earlier, with the situation with our modern culture and our modern. It does exactly the opposite thing. It does not inspire one to appreciate their own powers of imagination. It inspires people to, it destroys that capability. And this is why art is a province of cultural warfare, why the oligarchy has always used art to destroy the culture. And one of the things that's so important in our movement is to promote great classical art and culture and to be uncompromising on that. And I know we get lots of flack from people who say, I like this other stuff, but it's not whether you like it or not that's the issue, is what does it do to you? And what is the intention of what it's doing to you? So that's another parenthesis. But I think from the standpoint of getting beyond the domain of sense perception and getting a positive idea of creativity, you see think about now in your own mind, what's exhibited here as a principle and what we just talked about with Kepler's principle of universal gravitation. In both cases, the idea is a real idea. It's not an idea about something that's not real. It's an idea about something that actually exists in the universe. And yet, it's completely outside the domain of sense perception, but it's totally clear and distinct. And of course, in both cases, the domain of sense perception gives you nothing but an unclear idea. If you were to try and analyze this picture by going down to the smallest level and look at each brush stroke and each color and everything else, you could do it, forever, and you would never, with that kind of analysis, actually get the idea that's inspired in the mind by an immediate glance, interaction of the mind with this type of picture. So let me move on to the next example. I know I'm going quickly, but sometimes a presto can work pretty well. So since we've been talking about light and sense perception, I'm going to shift to another example of light and sense perception, and that's the relationship between light and heat. Okay, here it is. Now, you're all familiar with the fact that there is a relationship between light and heat. And this is another principle that Lynn talks about a lot, and is important with Kepler, and you see it here, which is the paradox between the juxtaposition of two different sense perceptions interacting with the same phenomena. Okay? In the case of light and heat, it's the question of light, which is we know light through our eyes, vision, and heat through touch. If we didn't have a sense of touch, we wouldn't know whether things were hot or cold. Okay? Now, we also know that when an object is heated, it tends to emit light, and vice versa. If you shine light on an object, it tends to warm up. Like if you take a magnifying glass, you can concentrate the sun's light and burn a piece of paper or whatever. And that there's also a relationship between light and heat and the color of the light that is associated with the heat. This is a typical or sort of an artist's depiction of that. Whereas it's cooler, this object, imagine an object where it's cooler down here and hotter up there, and you can see that the light, as the thing gets hotter, the color of the light changes. So you get a relationship between light and heat in terms of an increase in temperature and a decrease in an increase in temperature and a change in the color. Okay. Now, this phenomena obviously wasn't, it's been known for a long time. But in the 19th century, it became a real important focus for scientific investigation. Because, especially since the invention, as a result of Leibniz's work, of the heat-powered machine. Because prior to the development of the heat-powered machine, man did not use heat as a power source. We used heat for cooking or heating or something like that, right? But heat as a power source, but most power sources for economics was muscle power or wind power or gravity power or something like that. But the idea of trying to understand what heat is was a very important question, because heat, unlike gravity power, like when you have a water wheel and you use the power of gravity to push the wheel can go down, the water can go down, but you can also make the water go up again, right? But a heat engine works by having the heat flow from a hot body to a cold body, but you can't make the heat go back from a cold body to the hot body again, okay? So this new phenomena was seen as an opportunity by the oligarchy to reimpose this old Aristotelian idea through this concept of entropy, by saying that since heat flows from hot to cold and never from cold to hot, that this is a fundamental characteristic of the universe, that the universe always goes from states of higher order to lower order, and when you get to the end of the lowest order, you end up with no possibility of change any further. So now they've said, well, haha, Kepler, Leibniz, you guys, you thought you discovered creativity in the universe, but we can show you that it really was an illusion, because since everything in the universe emits heat, then all heat dissipates towards the, from hot to cold, that ultimately the universe is going to end up all dead, just like we said before. And in fact, there's a famous guy named Lord Kelvin who wrote a paper called On the Ultimate Heat Death of the Universe, in which he said, basically what I said, that the universe is going to end up dying. But then he said, don't be pessimistic, because some creative power will intervene from outside the universe to heat it up again, i.e. the emperor. Don't be pessimistic, you slaves, that the imperial system always seems to go into war and decay, because we always have an emperor up there who will save us before it gets too bad, which is like the illusion people have today that somehow, there won't be nuclear war because, quote, they won't let it happen. Anyway, if you look at this, you see this question of this problem of heat, and how this became an issue for raising the question about whether or not the universe actually was characterized by this creative principle. And the person who, well, who studied this the most or made the breakthrough on this was Max Planck. And you've heard Lynn talk about this quite a bit. So let me just illustrate what his breakthrough is, or at least a little bit, from the standpoint of what I was telling you. So here is, now, as you saw in that previous thing, it looked like at each temperature there were different colors. But if you actually were to analyze the light that was being emitted at any temperature, you would see that the light, all the colors were actually being emitted at any given temperature. But that the one of the colors, or a certain range of the colors, had more intensity, was brighter than any of the others. So this is a little chart which illustrates that. So on the black end that we saw on that bar, the thing was cooler, and all the light was being emitted. But the coolest, the most intense light, the brightest light, was in the infrared spectrum, beyond something that our eyes actually can see. And as you got hotter, the most intense light, as you get hotter, the most intense light gets more towards the visible colors of the rainbow, and it goes from red to yellow to green and so forth. So you can see that this right here, 6,000 degrees Kelvin, is the approximate temperature of the surface of the sun. So in that case, something that's that hot will emit light whose biggest intensity is in the yellow range. But if you take a prism and break up that light, you see that all the colors are in there, but the most intense one is going to be in the yellow. That's why the sun looks yellow. Okay? So the question that Planck was trying to discover, or that a lot of scientists were trying to discover, but Planck was the one who did it, was why is it that it works this way? Why is it that at any given temperature there's a peak? And how come that peak changes according to this, in this way, with temperature? That is, if you look at this, you know, here you have 3,000 degrees and 6,000 degrees is double the temperature, right? But the intensity is much greater, more than double, right? Why does this intensity go up so fast compared to the shift in the color? So the two questions are why at an individual, at any particular temperature, there's a peak, and then why does the peak shift the way it shifts? And nobody could figure this out. Everybody was trying to come up with some explanation for why it worked this way. Yeah?
Can you define intensity?
Brightness is a common, brightness. And you feel the difference between brightness and, like on your eyes when you see a very, very bright light. Like if you go by a construction site and they're doing arc welding, and they tell you, they even have signs up sometimes, they don't look directly at the welding because it'll hurt your eyes. So that light is very, very intense because the temperature is very hot. And that light, even though you can't feel the temperature, could hurt your eyes because it's so bright. And you can see it back in that other picture. If you remember, the white light was much more bright. That was just an animation. That wasn't an actual, that was just a graphic. That wasn't an actual object. So everybody was trying to figure out how this thing worked, right? And what Planck, and they were trying to do it from the standpoint of the domain of sense perception. Now what I'm about to explain might be a little bit difficult, but bear with me because it's the fundamental principle of modern science. And that is that if you think about this, there's this change in temperature, or let's put it this way, the change in intensity is continuous, appears to be continuous, right? That is, you can get bright and you can get a little more bright, and the difference between bright and a little more bright can be as small as you want, right? In other words, it's like dialing up the brightness. It doesn't, it goes continuously. And the change in color goes continuously too. That is, there's no sharp line between red and orange, or orange and yellow. It starts red and gets a little more orange, and it starts orange and gets a little more yellow, and then it gets a little more green. But there's no real jump. There's no point at which it's no longer yellow and just green. It's always sort of smushed into it, right? So you would think that the on the fundamental level that this was continuous, that that heat could increase continuously, and that the light changed continuously, and that the color changed continuously. But every effort to try and come up with a mathematical formula that described this relationship failed. Just like with Kepler and the vicarious hypothesis. Any attempt to find the place where that white dot would be failed. And so Planck said, well, the problem is you're looking for the wrong thing. These things are not continuous. They actually are ordered according to steps, which he called quanta, quantized steps. And that, therefore, when something appeared to be in equilibrium, that is, a state of no change, it actually was in a state of a great potential for change, a higher potential for change. Now, this really turned science on its head. Because remember what I was saying about entropy, that with the idea of the heat-powered machine, they said, well, when heat goes from a high temperature to a low temperature, you're increasing the entropy. And if that's the way the universe works, then man can make all these creative discoveries that we want, but the universe will always work against it, because the universe is always trying to seek a state of equilibrium. Right? That was the argument. And Planck showed, well, wait a minute. What you think is equilibrium, what your eyes, what your touch, what your sense perception says is equilibrium, is not equilibrium. It's an actual state of a higher potential for change, a greater potential for change. And Planck actually came to New York in 1908 and gave a series of lectures at Columbia University in which he outlined this argument. And it's a very painstaking and rigorous argument in which he says, and he did this many places, that wasn't the only place, in which he says, okay, when you look at the world according to the domain of sense perception, you can make an argument that there are some things in the universe which tend irreversibly from higher states of organization to lower states. That is, they increase their entropy. Okay, like heat, or putting a cube of sugar in a cup of hot coffee, right? It gets, the cube goes from, you go from a state in which all the sugar is concentrated in one place to where all the sugar is dispersed, right? But you can't get the sugar, once it does that, you can't get it back into the cube. It's irreversible, okay? So the argument was that, well, if the universe is irreversibly anti-entropic, man can do all these great things with the economy and improve science and technology and art and everything else, but ultimately the universe is going to push it all back down into entropy, into decay. And Planck said, well, the problem is that that's an illusion. The universe is actually characterized by a process of irreversible anti-entropy. And the product of the goal of the subject, the most important subject of modern science right now, is to do what Kepler did with universal gravitation, is to elaborate that idea of irreversible anti-entropy, which is another way of saying what I started this discussion with, that we have to make our conception of creativity per se less imperfect. And then we can get the passion to really fight the oligarchy.
So that's why I apologize for having to talk so fast and move so quickly. We do have another event later, but I can take some questions, and I hope this gave you a little bit of a taste of things. So go ahead.
So is the problem with entropy when people try to extend it to a large scale? Because you're saying that entropy of small contained systems, entropy holds.
Except that there's no such thing as a small contained system in the universe.
So are you saying that on a small scale, like heat going
Well,
behaving in that way, that's not a description of entropy? It should
well,
be
for example, yeah, well, it is and it isn't, because take a heat-powered machine, okay? So if you take the contained heat-powered machine, like the Carnot engine, right? You get, you could say, okay, there's two processes. One is that the heat is exchanged, and the other is that the state of organization of the machine is changed. That's what they call entropy. But what is the machine? The machine is a construction created by the mind. And it exists in a universe which is actually doing work in the universe, changing the universe. So even in that example, you can take the cylinder where the heat is exchanged and limit it to that, but what created the cylinder? So, it's sort of ironical, because even Planck and Einstein used the calculation of entropy as a means to prove some of their cases. But they understood that in a certain sense, it's very much like the vicarious hypothesis of Kepler, right? In which Kepler said, okay, if there was uniform motion, where would that thing be? Where would that point of non-uniformity be? And that's the way they say, okay, if there were entropy, how, and these, for example, these bodies are in thermodynamic equilibrium, what would be the characteristic of the thermodynamic, what would be the equilibrium? And the only way to get equilibrium is to have something that's completely.
So you're saying the process of containing it adds order to the system?
Yeah.
Which cancels that. So
Right, because ultimately you have to take the universe as a whole as your system. Right?
No question.
Yeah.
So are you, with the quantum jumps, are you saying that dotted line in the middle is actually jumpy?
From place to place, yeah, it jumps.
So if you looked at the Phi structure of that line, would it be jumpy and not continuous? That dotted line?
Well, it's a little more. That's a little too simplistic way to put it, I think. But I think it would be too hard to explain to get there. And I apologize for that. Let me just show you one more picture. I actually forgot about, but just to illustrate this point, because you raised it on this question of the universe. This is a new picture that was just released by NASA. Okay, and this, could you turn off the light so that people can see this? This is a really fascinating picture, I think. It's of a galaxy called Hercules A. Okay, now this picture is superimposed. It's two pictures. It's a picture in the visible light range from the Hubble, and then it's a picture in the microwave range from, I believe, another orbiting telescope, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But here's the thing. This part right here is a galaxy. Okay, this is not a star. This is billions of stars. This is a galaxy. It's smaller than the Milky Way, but if you could get closer to this galaxy, you would see like what we see in the Milky Way, billions and billions and billions of stars. And they're all orbiting a central point. Now, these jets here are in the microwave region, okay? And that means they're below the visible light range. And these jets, look at the size of these jets compared to the size of the galaxy, right? These are at least 10 times as big as the galaxy, right? And these are primarily jets of small subatomic particles, electrons mostly, circulating around. And you can see there's a lot of structure in these jets. There's a lot of spiral motion, there's a lot of vorticity, and so on and so forth. So here you have, on a very large scale, I think the distance from here to here is like 20,000, 30,000 light years. I mean, it's a huge distance, right? And yet, this huge distance of supposedly empty space is being structured and organized. And, I'm not, there's all kinds of ways to look at it. Is what something happening in the galaxy producing the jets, or are the jets, or is that which is producing the jets organizing the galaxy? These are questions for astrophysicists to debate and figure out, which is one reason why we need a space program. But what this kind of thing suggests is that on very large scales in the universe, that you're actually getting a process in which new states and higher orders are being created. This is not the only one, but it's one that that just was released, and it just fascinated me, so I thought I'd share it with you. Go ahead.
You mentioned that the senses are not all of reality. There's creativity and things that we can't know just by our senses alone, that the mind would have to think of them and imagine and interpret them. But my question is, where would we be without our senses? We'd be blind, deaf, dumb.
Sure.
You've got to have your senses.
Sure.
In a way, couldn't you say, like, the senses are like the stomach that digests food? Reality is the way the material universe is, and by our senses we digest that in a way that the stomach digests food.
Well,
our eyes, vision, taste, and touch, they relate to us, the material universe, the way it is, but there are other things that we can't interpret exactly.
Yes and no. It is in the sense that the senses are biological organs. They're an interaction of our biology with the world around us. But it doesn't tell us how the world is. Like take some of the examples I gave you, like the example of Rembrandt. The senses, if you didn't have eyes, you couldn't see it. And it's the light reflecting off the canvas which produces the image that gets to your mind through your eyes. But what's in your mind is not the light. The light doesn't produce that. What produces it is your imagination. So your senses are stimulated by the outside world. But what you actually see is not what stimulates your eyes. What you see is actually what's in your imagination, and that imagination is what is real, and that imagination has to become less imperfect, because the question you got, how do I know? Here's the question that comes up. How do I know that what's in my imagination is a reflection of what actually is outside of me, or just something that I conjured up in my own mind? And the answer to that is you don't. You know that by interacting again with the world and seeing how the ideas which are generated in your mind interact with the world. And this is the process of creativity. And this is what gets destroyed when you just look at the world purely from the domain of sense perception. We have senses, obviously, that enables us to interact with the world. But we know the world is much more than what our senses can see. Like when we look at this picture, you can't see this. The light here is the only way we can see that is to have an instrument which interacts with a part of the electromagnetic spectrum which our eyes are not sensitive to, and yet it's part of the real world. Yeah, you had a question, or did you have a... Go ahead.
So you're saying that Rembrandt was consciously using art as a medium to communicate directly with the human mind?
Yes, absolutely. In his case, for sure. The great artist, Leonardo, Rembrandt, I think, is one of the best to really look at this. And you have at the Museum of Art here, a bunch of Rembrandts. I really encourage people to go down and look at them, because he is just a master. And he was a real scientist in terms of studying how light and the use of different colors and chemical mixtures and so forth would produce this effect so as to induce the mind, the imagination, to create a thought. So just think about that process, right? You take a physical things, chemistry, mechanics, all these things to make a mechanical object, which is what a canvas on a piece of paper is, for the sole purpose of inducing a thought. Now, why doesn't God do that too? Okay? So that's what you're talking about when you look at this black body radiation or gravitation. You're looking at the generation of ideas. And that's how great scientists understand these things. And when you start to begin to think about the world that way, you can begin to get a sense in your mind of what actually is, what mankind really is, as opposed to just not liking what the oligarchy says we are.
That self-portrait, I forget whether it's in the trip or the net, but after spending some time in front of it, it had an effect on me as just a questioning of what I was doing. Because this is late in his life, and I've seen the others, and I've read the Fidelios that were very helpful in setting that up. So you see, almost like listening to early Mozart symphonies as opposed to the last five, and you
Right.
see this process being expressed. And it's difficult to describe how drawn I was and provoked by the thing that no print can obviously bring out. So just to echo what you were saying, in terms of really you have to just stand there and let the piece work.
Yeah.
And then there's really this sense that a guy's trying to communicate with you. I'm doing it successfully for 400 years ago, quite effectively. Because you see his genius, and what I was thinking was, well, what am I doing?
Well, that's it evokes all kinds of thoughts like that, but that's what art does. But how does that work, right? How is it the case that it's these thoughts which are the real things? I mean, what I'm describing here is the well-known principle of creativity. Like you take the opening chorus to Henry V by Shakespeare, right? And he has the chorus come out on an empty stage, and he says, hey, you're going to see something here, but it's in just this little stage. And, I'm going to depict to you great armies, kings, and armies fighting, and decisions of state and nations, and ideas on which societies rise and fall, and people live and die. And it's all going to be in this little stage. So he says, how's he put it? He says, let me on your imaginary forces work. Right? Let your thoughts bedeck our kings, right? So this is what art is about. It's about the evoking of thoughts, but it's the thoughts also with science that change the world. It's ideas which are the substance of the universe, and ideas are the substance of the world. And we live in a culture which has denigrated the idea of the idea. And that is why people can't understand that they're living in a world which is going to kill them. And we have to somehow find a way to inspire at least the small number of people. We don't need to inspire everybody, but if we can inspire a small number of people to become passionate about defending the idea of the idea, then mankind will have a chance of survival. If you look at the history of mankind, you see that it's always been that way. Look at the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, you had a Black Death which wiped out half the population of Europe. And it was a small handful of people which said, no, it's the ideas. The problem is we lost the sense of the idea. And the great artists like Brunelleschi or Leonardo or the great thinkers like Machiavelli came forward and presented the idea. And they were mocked, they were attacked, they were a minority, they were in power, out of power, in jail, out of jail. But they created, they revived the idea long enough for it to become cemented and propagate through other cultures to the point where, to make a long story short, it ultimately created the foundation for the establishment of a form of government like what our constitutional republic is. So that's the level we have to think about. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, even with creativity, aren't there certain physical laws of the universe that you can't be creative about, that you can change, like gravity always pulls or attracts, or electric charges, like charges always repel each other, and unlike charges always attract each other.
Yeah, but we can.
How could you change that? How could man be creative?
But we can
to
control,
change those
because
things?
we can use that characteristic, and we can control them. Like we can't at this point, we haven't yet at this point made new change the gravitational structure of the solar system. But if we're going to defend ourselves ultimately from asteroids, we're going to have to. Gravity existed before Kepler discovered it. But after his discovery of gravity, man increased his power over the universe because now gravity became something that we could then begin to bring under our mind. Yeah, bring it under the power of our mind. The universe is inherently creative, but its creativity is advanced only through the power of the human mind. That's what gives it more substance. And so therefore we have to really think about how our minds work and be respectful of this power of the human mind instead of what our culture has done, which is to denigrate it to the point where we're on the brink of a collapse of civilization or possibly extinction of the human race. Any other quick questions? I apologize that I have another event to go to. Yeah, go ahead.
Your talk makes me think of something I've been pondering for the last 2 or 3 years on a daily basis, and it goes back to the 1924 Olympics with Eric Liddell. I believe he was a 100-meter world record holder, and then you had Abraham, the 400-meter record holder of the world. One is a Gentile, one is a Jew. They're representing England. Liddell was born in China, missionary family, and he and his sister were studying in England, and then he represented England at the Olympic Games. And at one point, and they made a movie about this called Chariots of Fire, if you remember, in 1980. Mm-hmm. At that point I said, finally a good movie. For a while they're making junk. And so that gave me a lot of hope to seeing that movie. And the sister said to the brother there, Eric, God made you for China. What's this business about running? And Eric says, well, God made me fast. And when I run, I sense his pleasure. I'm still trying to grasp what that means.
Uh-huh.
That's where I am.
Well, Einstein had a similar idea, but not about his physical ideas, but or Beethoven in his famous Heiligenstadt Testament, where he was very despondent about the loss of his hearing. And he said, how can a musician be deprived of his sense organ through which his art is expressed? And, he actually contemplated suicide at that point. And then he said, but I can't do that because my mind still works. And I know that there are ideas and creations in my mind that have yet to come out. And if I were to cease to be, then those creations would never be brought into the world. So you will learn a lot by getting to know these great creative thinkers, because even though they are best known by their creative discoveries, every once in a while a little beam peeks out of this black box and lets us know what it is about that creativity that inspires us. Anyway, I think I apologize that I have to go to another presentation, but I hope I can get back up here and we can spend more time going through these things. And I think just by I felt I was taking a little bit of a risk to try and present so many complicated ideas so quickly in but sometimes just juxtaposing things together and letting them sit there sort of jangling in your heads works. So I hope it did. Yeah, I have to run, but go ahead real quick.
See, if an idea of creativity is classical, you get classical art, correct?
Yeah, sure.
But now, say you listen to the pieces, you step yard and you have an idea of what creativity is, but how do you practice science accordingly?
Science?
Yeah, how would you practice?
Study the great scientists. Study Kepler. I think I got to go. Daniel's gonna answer all these questions.
Very confident to be